The old veteran's hands trembled as he fumbled with his wallet at the counter. Behind him, impatience turned to cruelty as a well-dressed stranger began to mock him. "Some of us have actual jobs to get to," the man sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The diner fell silent. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. Frank Harmon, with his faded veteran's cap and quiet dignity, stood alone in his humiliation until the bell above the door chimed. The tall figure who stepped inside would transform this ordinary Thursday morning into something no one in Millfield would ever forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the clouded windows of Miller's Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. The place hummed with the familiar symphony of silverware clinking against plates and the low murmur of conversation that swelled with the breakfast rush. In the far corner, partially hidden by a drooping fern, sat Frank Harmon. His weathered hands, once steady enough to disarm landmines in the rain-soaked jungles of Vietnam, now trembled slightly as he fumbled with his wallet. At 73, Frank's body had betrayed him in small ways, but his eyes remained sharp, taking in everything from beneath the brim of his faded Navy veteran's cap. "Just the usual, Linda," he said quietly to the waitress who'd known him for 15 years. Linda nodded, her smile genuine but hurried. "Coffee and blueberry pancakes coming up, Frank. Busy morning today." Frank watched her disappear into the kitchen. Tuesday mornings were his ritual, a small luxury after paying his monthly bills. His Social Security check stretched thin between medication costs and helping his daughter with her 2 boys since her husband walked out last spring. The diner had filled quickly. Every stool at the counter was taken, the booths packed with families and morning commuters. Frank savored these moments, surrounded by life and noise, a stark contrast to the silence of his small apartment. He rose carefully, joints protesting, and made his way to the restroom. The narrow path between tables required concentration. When he returned, a young man in an expensive suit stood impatiently by the register, checking his watch every few seconds. "Finally," the man muttered as Frank approached, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I've got places to be, old-timer." Frank lowered his eyes, stepping aside. "Sorry about that. Go ahead," the man snorted, tapping his credit card against the counter. "Some of us have actual jobs to get to. Not all of us can spend all day nursing a coffee." The diner quieted. Conversations paused. Forks hovered mid-air. Linda emerged from the kitchen, Frank's plate in hand, her expression hardening. "Sir, you need to," she began, but the man cut her off. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. These old guys come in, take forever, hold everything up." He gestured toward Frank's cap. "Probably tells the same war stories to anyone. Who'll listen, right? Living in the past." Frank's shoulders curved inward, the weight of public humiliation pressing down. He'd faced enemy fire with less dread than this moment, standing exposed before judging eyes, his dignity unraveling thread by thread. "I'll just go," Frank whispered, reaching for his wallet. The man rolled his eyes. "Yeah, that would be..." The bell above the door chimed. Sunlight spilled across the threshold as a tall figure stepped inside. The newcomer paused, surveying the scene with calm, assessing eyes. The atmosphere shifted, as if the very air had changed charge. Colonel James Mercer stood in his dress blues, medals glinting in the morning light. At 62, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. His gaze swept across the diner, settling first on Frank's veteran cap, then on the young man's sneering face. The diner fell completely silent. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to quiet in anticipation. No one yet realized the significance of this moment, how a chance encounter on an ordinary Tuesday would set in motion events that would transform not just Frank's life, but the entire town of Millfield. The Colonel's arrival was no coincidence, and what would unfold in the coming hours would remind everyone of debts unpaid and honor long forgotten. The alarm clock glowed 5:15 a.m. in the darkness of Frank Harmon's bedroom, though his eyes had been open since 4:58. Old habits die hard. 47 years since Vietnam, and his body still couldn't forget the pre-dawn watch rotations. "All right, time to move," Frank murmured to himself, his voice gravelly in the silent room. He sat up slowly, the weight of 73 years pressing against his spine. The first light of dawn hadn't yet touched the window blinds of his modest one-bedroom apartment. Photographs lined his dresser, his late wife Eleanor smiling on their wedding day, Frank in uniform with his platoon, his daughter and grandsons at last year's 4th of July picnic. Frank switched on the bedside lamp and pulled back the covers. His right leg ended just below the knee, the sheets smooth where flesh and bone should have continued. The explosion that took it had been quick, a pressure plate near Da Nang in 71. The memory of that heat still visited him some nights. With practiced movements, Frank reached for his prosthetic leg, resting against the nightstand. The modern model was lightweight, a far cry from the clunky apparatus he'd first been fitted with at Walter Reed. His VA benefits had finally covered this upgrade 3 years ago. "Small mercies. Good morning, old friend," he said, fitting the socket over his residual limb, adjusting the straps with fingers that knew every buckle by touch. The apartment was neat as a pin. Military corners on the bed, books aligned on shelves, dishes washed and put away. Since Eleanor passed 6 years ago from cancer, orderliness had become Frank's anchor. When the world spins chaotic, control what you can. In the bathroom, Frank splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection. Deep lines mapped a life lived earnestly. Crow's feet from squinting in the jungle sun, furrows across his forehead from years of responsibility, brackets around his mouth from both smiles and grief. He combed his silver hair and dressed carefully. Pressed. Khaki pants, a blue button-down shirt, polished shoes. Eleanor always said presentation matters, especially when you're hurting inside. Frank moved to the kitchen, starting the coffee maker, another ritual. While it brewed, he opened the small wooden box on the counter, removed his medications, and arranged them precisely. Blood pressure, cholesterol, pain management for the phantom sensations that still haunted his missing limb. "Down the hatch," he whispered, swallowing each pill with a sip of water. The coffee finished brewing, filling the apartment with rich aroma. Frank poured it into his Marine Corps mug, black, no sugar, the way he'd learned to drink it in the service when luxuries were scarce and gratitude for small comforts was abundant. He moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to watch the neighborhood awaken. Thursday, Miller's Diner Day, the one weekly extravagance he permitted himself. Eleanor and he had discovered the diner 3 decades ago when they first moved to Millfield. Every Thursday morning they'd share breakfast there, even after money got tight raising their daughter. After Eleanor died, Frank couldn't bear to break the tradition. Now those Thursday mornings connected him to her memory and to the outside world he found increasingly difficult to navigate. Frank sipped his coffee, watching a young jogger pass below his window. So many rushing through life, he thought. Never. Realizing how quickly it all goes by, he reached for his wallet on the counter, checking inside. 2 $20 bills and someone's. Enough for breakfast and a small tip for Linda, who always remembered he liked his pancakes with extra blueberries. Frank placed his veteran's cap on his head, adjusting it slightly in the hallway mirror. Not vanity, respect. Respect for the uniform he no longer wore but still represented. The wall clock read 6:30 a.m., time to go. Frank's route to the diner never varied. 3 blocks east, 1 north. The predictability comforted him in a world that had grown increasingly unfamiliar. He locked his door, tested the handle twice, then straightened his shoulders. Another day, another chance to carry himself with the dignity Eleanor had always admired. Miller's Diner glowed like a beacon in the morning light, its neon open sign humming against the plate glass window. Inside, the Thursday breakfast rush was in full swing. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee, the symphony of conversation rising and falling like tide. Frank stepped through the door at precisely 7:05 a.m., just as he had every Thursday for 6 years. Linda spotted him immediately from behind the counter and waved, her smile genuine. "Morning, Frank. Your usual table's waiting." Frank nodded appreciatively. His corner spot, the one that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen, remained empty despite the crowd. Small courtesies like this made the world feel a little kinder. He made his way carefully between tables, accepting brief nods from the regulars, the mailman finishing his pre-route coffee, the young mother with twins who always asked how he was doing. Their familiar faces were part of the comfort this place offered him. After settling at his table, Frank realized he'd forgotten to bring enough cash for the recent price increase. He'd need to pay with his card today. With a slight grimace, he rose and walked to the counter, reaching into his back pocket for his wallet. The line was 3 deep. Frank waited patiently, rehearsing his order, though it hadn't changed in years. When his turn came, his fingers, stiff from arthritis and the morning chill, fumbled with the plastic card. It slipped from his grasp, landing on the floor. "Sorry about that," Frank murmured, bending awkwardly to retrieve it. His prosthetic leg made the simple motion a careful negotiation. The movement took time, precious seconds that stretched uncomfortably. "In the busy diner, Jesus Christ, can we move this along?" The sharp voice cut through the ambient chatter like a knife. Frank straightened slowly, card now in hand, and turned toward the voice. A man in his 30s stood behind him, expensive watch glinting beneath a tailored suit cuff. His face was handsome in the cold way of financial district billboards, all sharp angles and impatience. "I'm sorry," Frank said quietly, stepping aside. "Go ahead." The man, Travis, as the barista would later call him when preparing his complicated order, scoffed. "No, finish what you're doing, Grandpa. We're all just standing here with nowhere important to be." Heat rose to Frank's cheeks as he turned back to the counter. His fingers trembled worse now, fumbling with the card as he tried to hand it to Linda. The plastic slipped again, clattering against the countertop. "Oh, for God's sake," Travis groaned dramatically. "It's like watching paint dry. Some of us have actual jobs to get to." Frank kept his eyes down, focusing on completing the transaction. Linda's face had hardened, her movements quick and efficient as she tried to speed things along. "Your order will be right out, Frank," she said pointedly, loud enough for others to hear. Travis wasn't finished. "You know what? This is exactly what's wrong with this country. Everyone walking on eggshells around these useless old-timers." His voice carried through the now quieting diner. "My tax dollars paying for his golf. Games and early bird specials while I work 60-hour weeks." Frank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd survived the Mekong Delta. He could survive this small man's cruelty. The other customers shifted uncomfortably. A few stared intently at their phones. An elderly woman pursed her lips disapprovingly, but remained silent. A middle-aged man, in work boots, half rose from his seat, then sank back down after meeting Travis's challenging glare. "What's that cap you're wearing, anyway?" Travis continued, noticing Frank's veteran's designation. "Bought it at a surplus store to get the senior discount, right? Drain on the system is what you are." Each word landed like shrapnel. Frank had faced fire before, but this public humiliation cut deeper than he wanted to admit. His hand instinctively touched the cap, the one he'd earned alongside men who never made it home. Linda stepped forward, coffee pot in hand. "Sir, that's enough." The bell above the door chimed, silencing her intervention. All eyes turned to the entrance as a tall figure in military dress blues stepped inside, medals catching the morning light. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even Travis fell silent, sensing the change but not yet understanding its significance. The bell above Miller's diner door sang out its familiar melody, cutting through the tension like a sudden breeze through stagnant air. Conversation faltered, mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Even Travis's stream of vitriol momentarily dried up as heads turned toward the entrance. The morning light silhouetted her figure for a moment before she stepped fully inside, tall, lean, and carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to being respected without having to demand it. Her military jacket sat perfectly on her shoulders, weathered enough to suggest it had seen real service rather than fashion wear. The name tape above the right pocket read "Cruz" in block letters that had faded slightly with time and elements. Sergeant Elena Cruz surveyed the room with calm, assessing eyes, the kind that had scanned far more dangerous terrain than a small-town diner. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing a face marked by both strength and compassion. A thin scar traced from her left temple to her jawline, a silent testament to sacrifices made far from home. She moved into the diner with deliberate steps, boots making the softest sound against the worn linoleum floor. The silence stretched as she took in the scene. Frank, standing rigidly by the counter, his veteran's cap slightly askew. Travis with his expression caught between annoyance and uncertainty. Linda behind the counter, coffee pot still raised like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to use. Elena's gaze settled on Frank first, noting his stance, the way he carried himself, despite the obvious discomfort of the moment. Her eyes flickered to his prosthetic leg, then up to the insignia on his cap. Recognition and something deeper passed across her features. "Morning," she said to the room at large, her voice rich and steady. She moved to the counter, positioning herself not directly between Frank and Travis, but at an angle that subtly changed the dynamic. Not aggressive, but present. Not threatening, but unmistakably solid. Travis shifted his weight, glancing at his watch with exaggerated impatience. "Look, some of us have places to be. Is there a problem here?" Elena asked. The question floated in the air, deceptively simple. She hadn't raised her voice. There was no challenge in her tone, just a calm inquiry that somehow demanded an honest answer. The diner seemed to hold its collective breath. Linda set down the coffee pot, tension visible in the line of her shoulders. "Just trying to get my breakfast before my meeting," Travis replied, voice slightly less certain than before. This gentleman was holding up the line." Elena nodded once, absorbing the information without judgment. Her eyes met Frank's briefly, a silent communication passing between them, the unspoken language of those who had worn the uniform. "Sir," she addressed Frank with quiet respect, "were you finished at the counter?" Frank straightened almost imperceptibly, military muscle memory responding to her presence. "Yes, ma'am. Just waiting on my order." "Perfect timing, then," Eleanor replied, turning slightly toward Travis. "Seems like the issue has resolved itself." Travis opened his mouth, closed it, then checked his watch again. The calculation was visible on his face, whether to continue his tirade with this new variable in the equation. Elena simply stood there, her presence filling more space than her physical form. The medals on her jacket caught the light. Small, rectangles of color that spoke volumes to those who understood their language. "Whatever," Travis finally muttered, stepping forward to place his order. The spell broken, conversations gradually resumed around the diner. Frank nodded almost imperceptibly to Elena before returning to his corner table, back straight despite the morning's indignities. Elena ordered a black coffee and 2 eggs over easy, then leaned against the counter, seemingly content to wait her turn. Her attention never fully left Frank, though she didn't stare. It was the watchfulness of someone who had learned that sometimes the most important things weren't happening in the most obvious places. What no one in the diner yet realized, not Frank, not Travis, not even Linda, who prided herself on knowing, everyone's business was that Sergeant Elena Cruz hadn't walked into Miller's diner by accident. And before the day was through, her presence would set in motion events that would change everything for Frank Harmon. Travis's order, a complicated concoction of egg whites, avocado toast, and specifications about exactly how his latte should be prepared, hung in the air between him and Linda. His momentary retreat had been short-lived, confidence returning as Elena quietly sipped her coffee at the counter. She cut the line, Travis said suddenly, jabbing a finger toward Elena. I was next. Linda's expression tightened. Sir, I'm taking orders as fast as I can. No, this is ridiculous, Travis continued, voice rising again. First the old guy, now G.I. Jane here. He turned toward Elena, irritation overcoming his brief uncertainty. Who are you anyway? Halloween's not for months. The diner seemed to inhale collectively. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere in the back. Frank, from his corner table, set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Elena took another sip of her coffee before setting it down, the movement unhurried. The morning light through the windows caught the amber liquid as it settled in the cup. For 3 heartbeats, she said nothing. My name is Sergeant Elena Cruz, she finally replied, her voice level and clear enough to carry through the now quieting. In diner, United States Army, 3rd Special Forces Group. She didn't raise her volume, yet somehow her words commanded the room. Travis snorted, adjusting his expensive watch. Well, Sergeant, some of us have actual jobs with deadlines. Not everyone gets paid by taxpayers to... Elena set her cup down and turned to face him fully. With deliberate movements, she removed her military jacket, folding it with precision before placing it on the counter beside her. The T-shirt she wore underneath was simple olive drab, but what caught every eye in the diner was what it revealed. Her right arm, marked with a jagged scar that ran from shoulder to elbow and across her chest, a row of ribbons and medals pinned with military exactness. Even those who couldn't read the language of military decorations could sense their significance. The Purple Heart was recognizable to most. The bronze star with V device spoke volumes to those who understood. You're right, Elena said, her voice still calm. I do have a job. For 18 years, my job has been to ensure people like you can wake up safe, order complicated breakfasts, and even behave rudely in public without fear. She gestured toward Frank with a slight nod, just like he did for those who came before us. She stepped closer to Travis, still maintaining a respectful distance. But there's one thing my job doesn't cover: standing by while cowards bully. Veterans who sacrifice parts of themselves so you wouldn't have to. The diner had fallen completely silent. The cook had emerged from the kitchen, spatula in hand, frozen in the doorway. Linda stood motionless behind the counter. The family in the booth by the window had stopped mid-bite. Travis's face flushed red. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally and finding none. The audience he'd played to earlier had transformed into witnesses to his humiliation. I didn't, he began, voice suddenly less certain. How was I supposed to know his cap? Elena interrupted gently. His bearing, the way he carries himself despite pain. These things are visible to those who choose to see. She wasn't berating him now, but teaching, her tone suggesting that understanding was still possible even now. The silence stretched. A child whispered a question to his mother and was quietly hushed. The ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, its soft whirring the only sound in the stillness. Frank remained seated, back straight, eyes forward. He hadn't asked for this intervention, hadn't sought to be the center of this moment. Yet something had shifted in his posture, A heaviness lifting, perhaps, or a dignity reinforced. Travis swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The expensive watch suddenly seemed to weigh heavily on his wrist. The entire diner waited for his next move. What happened next would be recounted throughout Millfield for years to come. How a simple Thursday morning at Miller's Diner became something unexpected, something that reminded an entire community of debts unpaid and honors nearly forgotten. The silence in Miller's Diner hung thick as morning fog. Travis shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other, his earlier confidence evaporating under Elena's steady gaze and the collective witness of everyone present. Elena turned slightly, her eyes finding Frank in his corner seat. Something unspoken passed between them, a question asked and permission granted through the subtle language of those who understand duty and respect. "You know," Elena said, her voice carrying through the stillness without needing to rise, "there's something fascinating about diners like this one." She glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with various patrons. "We sit next to each other every day, share the same space, but rarely know each other's stories." She gestured toward Frank, whose weathered hands remained steady around his coffee cup. "That gentleman over there is Frank Harmon, Vietnam. 2 tours with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, 1970 to 72. Elena spoke with the precision of someone recounting sacred text. "His unit came under heavy fire while evacuating civilians from a village. Frank carried 3 children to safety before stepping on a landmine that took his right leg below the knee." A soft gasp came from the young mother with twins. Her hands instinctively moved to her children's shoulders. "He received the Bronze Star with valor and the Purple Heart," Elena continued. "But ask him about it, and he'll tell you about Johnny Mendez from Albuquerque who loved baseball, or David Cohen from Philadelphia who wrote poetry, or Marcus Washington from Detroit who had just become a father." Her voice softened. "Men who never came home." The mailman at the counter nodded slowly, his own Vietnam veteran cap suddenly more visible to everyone. "Frank spends every Tuesday afternoon volunteering at the VA hospital in Riverside, sits with veterans who don't have family visitors, listens to their stories, makes sure they know they're not forgotten." Elena's scar seemed more prominent now in the diner's light, her own sacrifices silently acknowledged. Travis stared at the floor, the flush on his face deepening. His expensive watch caught the light as he fidgeted with his sleeve. "The thing about sacrifice," Elena said, now turning back to Travis, her tone not unkind but unwavering, "is that it's often invisible to those who benefit from it most." She stepped closer to him, close enough that her next words were just between them, though in the silence they carried. "The man you just humiliated risked his life so you could enjoy your overpriced coffee in peace, so you could rush to your meeting without worrying about anything more dangerous than traffic, so you could be free to be thoughtless, impatient, and unkind, because that freedom too is what he fought to protect." Linda moved from behind the counter now, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She walked directly to Frank's table. "On the house today, Frank," she said, refilling his cup. "And every Thursday from now on." A murmur of approval rippled through the diner. The cook nodded firmly from the kitchen doorway. An elderly couple in the booth nearest Frank raised their cups in a silent toast. Travis opened his mouth, closed. It then opened it again. I wasn't." The words twisted and died in his throat. He glanced around the diner once more, seeing now what he'd failed to see before. Not just Frank, but the mailman with his veteran's cap, the elderly man by the window whose cane bore a Marine Corps emblem, the quiet woman in the booth who wore a gold star mother's pin on her sweater. The weight of all he didn't know, hadn't bothered to see, seemed to press down on his shoulders. Without finishing his sentence, Travis turned abruptly, his half-prepared order abandoned. He pushed through the door, the bell jingling discordantly as he escaped into the morning light. Elena watched him go, her expression neither triumphant nor angry. She picked up her jacket, slipped it back on with practiced ease, and moved across the diner toward Frank's table. What she would say to him, and why she had really come to Miller's Diner on this particular Thursday, would change the course of Frank Harmon's life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The chair across from Frank made a soft, scraping sound as Elena pulled it back. She sat down with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving with purpose, her posture perfect, but not rigid. Between them, the table seemed smaller somehow, a brief island in the bustling diner that had fallen into an unusual, respectful quiet. Frank's weathered hands cupped his coffee mug, the tremor in them now barely noticeable. His eyes, clear blue beneath silver brows, held Elena's gaze with quiet dignity. "I didn't need you to do that," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age and experience. Elena nodded once. "I know you didn't, sir." The morning light streamed through the window beside them, painting golden rectangles across the worn Formica tabletop. In that light, the years seemed to peel away from Frank's face momentarily, revealing glimpses of the young man who had once carried children through gunfire in a jungle half a world away. "Been handling myself a long time," Frank continued, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. "Made it through 2 tours, raised a daughter, buried a wife, figured I could handle one rude young man in a fancy suit." "No doubt in my mind, sir," Eleanor replied, her own smile warm but respectful. She didn't offer pity or overblown reverence, just the simple acknowledgement of one soldier to another. Frank studied her face, taking in the scar that traced her jawline, the confidence in her bearing, the medals she had earned. His throat worked for a moment before he spoke again. "They don't make 'em like you anymore," he said, voice suddenly thick with emotion. A single tear escaped, tracking down his lined cheek. He brushed it away quickly with the back of his hand. Embarrassed by the display, Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice low enough that only Frank could hear her next words. "No, sir," she said firmly. "They made us like you." Something shifted in Frank's expression then, a weight lifting perhaps, or a wound long unacknowledged finally being tended to. He nodded once, unable to speak for a moment. Behind the counter, Linda had been watching the exchange. She disappeared into the back, returning moments later with the manager, a stocky man named Robert, who had owned Miller's Diner for nearly 20 years. Robert approached their table, hands clasped respectfully in front of him. "Mr. Harmon," he said, his voice carrying through the still quiet diner, "I want you to know that your meal today is on the house." He paused, searching for the right words. "And I'd like to extend that to every Thursday from now on." Frank began to shake his head. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Robert interrupted gently. "My father served in Korea, never talked about it. I wish—" He cleared his throat. "I wish I'd thanked him properly before he was gone." The elderly couple who had silently toasted Frank earlier rose slowly from their booth. The man leaned heavily on his cane as they made their way to stand near Frank's table. "Thank you for your service, son," the man said, his own veteran's pin glinting on his lapel. One by one, others in the diner rose, the mailman with his Vietnam cap, the young mother with twins, the cook who had emerged from the kitchen wiping his hands on his apron. Even the teenage busboy stopped clearing tables to stand at attention. No one clapped. There were no cheers or shouts, just silent standing, a room full of people offering the most sincere form of respect they knew how to give. Frank remained seated, his back straight, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Eleanor stood beside him, her hand coming to rest lightly on his shoulder, not to support him but to connect with him. "Never expected anything for doing what needed doing," Frank said quietly, his voice steady despite the tears that now flowed freely down his cheeks. "That's exactly why you deserve it," Elena replied. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating this impromptu gathering, this moment of recognition decades overdue. Outside, the world continued moving at its hectic pace. Cars passed, pedestrians hurried to work, life marched forward. But inside Miller's diner, time stood still in the amber light of a Thursday morning as a community remembered what it meant to honor sacrifice with more than just words. Linda's hands trembled slightly as she tapped at her phone during her afternoon break. People need to see this, she murmured, uploading the security camera footage of that morning's events to the diner's social media page. The simple caption read, "Today, we witnessed something at Miller's Diner that reminded us what respect truly means." She couldn't have known what would happen next. By sunset, the video had been shared over 5,000 times. By midnight, it had crossed state lines. By morning, it had traveled around the world. Frank Harmon woke to his phone ringing at 6:17 a.m., his daughter's voice breathless on the other end. "Dad, have you seen it? You're everywhere." Frank sat on the edge of his bed, prosthetic leg not yet attached, confusion etching deeper lines into his weathered face. "Seen what, Katie?" The footage showed only the back of Frank's head, his veteran's cap clearly visible, but Elena's face was captured in perfect clarity as she stood with quiet authority, removing her jacket to reveal her medals, speaking words that had resonated with millions overnight. "The man you just humiliated risked his life so you could enjoy your overpriced coffee in peace." Frank's mailbox, typically empty save for bills, and the occasional letter from his grandsons began to fill. First a trickle, then a flood. "I served in Afghanistan. Your story reminded me why it mattered. My grandfather never talked about Vietnam. Watching that video made me understand him better. I'm a high school student who didn't care much about Veterans Day until now." Each envelope Frank opened with careful fingers at his small kitchen table. Each message he read completely, sometimes twice, sometimes aloud to himself in the quiet of his apartment. Robert, the diner's owner, called on Monday. "Frank, I can't keep up with the phone calls. Folks from 3 counties over are driving in just to sit at your table. They're calling it the respect table now." Frank's laugh was soft, tinged with disbelief. "Seems like a lot of fuss for nothing, Robert." "Not nothing, Frank. Never nothing." On Tuesday afternoon, as he made his weekly visit to the VA hospital, Frank found himself approached by veterans he'd sat with for years, now wanting to shake his hand, share their own stories, speak aloud the memories they'd kept buried. "You made people see us, Frank," said Richard, a Gulf War veteran who rarely spoke above a whisper. "Really see us." Wednesday brought Principal Matthews from Millfield High School to Frank's doorstep. "Mr. Harmon, we'd be honored if you would speak at our Veterans Day assembly." "Our students, they've watched the video. They want to hear from you." Frank's hand gripped the doorframe. "I'm not much for speeches, ma'am." The principal's smile was gentle. "You don't need to be. Just your presence would be enough." In his bathroom mirror that night, Frank studied his reflection. The same face that had looked back at him for 73 years now somehow belonged to a man people wanted to hear from. He straightened his shoulders, a decision forming in his eyes. Across town in his luxury apartment, Travis Mitchell sat in darkness, the blue light of his laptop screen illuminating his face. The comments scrolling beneath the viral video cut. "Like knives, imagine treating a veteran like that. This is what's wrong with our generation. Does anyone know who that guy in the suit is?" His finger hovered over his social media accounts, filled now with messages from college friends, business associates, even his mother in Cincinnati. With 3 decisive clicks, he deleted them all. The following morning, a plain envelope arrived at Frank's apartment with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "I will never be able to undo what I did, but I've made a donation to the VA hospital in your name. It doesn't fix anything. I'm learning that some debts can never be repaid in full. It wasn't signed, but Frank knew. He placed it carefully with the others, this testament to how a single moment of courage could ripple outward, changing not just the lives it touched directly, but countless others it would never know. Elena Cruz called on Friday, her voice warm through the phone line. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Harmon? It's only going to get bigger." Frank looked at the calendar on his wall, Veterans Day circled in red. For the first time in decades, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond surviving. "Yes, Sergeant," he replied. "I believe I am." Thursday morning arrived with a gentle rain washing Millfield's streets, droplets catching the early light like scattered diamonds. 1 week had passed since the incident that had transformed Miller's Diner from a local breakfast spot to something of a pilgrimage site. Frank approached the diner at his usual time, 7:05 a.m., umbrella held firmly in one hand, his steps measured and deliberate against the wet sidewalk. The familiar jingle of the bell announced his arrival, but today something was different. Robert stood waiting just inside, hands clasped before him, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Linda and the entire staff had gathered near the counter. The regular morning customers watched with anticipation. Coffee cups paused midway to lips. "Frank," Robert said, extending his hand, "we've been waiting for you." Frank glanced around, momentarily uncertain. "Everything all right?" Robert nodded, gently guiding Frank toward the corner, his usual spot. But the table had changed. The worn formica had been replaced with polished oak. The simple chairs now featured cushioned seats, and mounted on the wall above was a brass plaque gleaming in the soft diner light. "Heroes Table," it read. "Reserved for those who served when called, sacrificed when needed, and remind us daily of the price of freedom." Below that, in smaller letters, "Inspired by Frank Harmon, Vietnam veteran, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, and by all who stand when others sit." Frank's hand rose involuntarily to his mouth. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "It's not much," Robert said quietly, "but it's permanent. This table will never be available for regular seating. It's reserved for veterans, first responders, anyone who's put themselves on the line for others." Linda stepped forward, placing a fresh cup of coffee on the table. "We've already had 3 veterans ask when you usually come in. They want to meet you." Frank's eyes glistened in the morning light. "I'm just one old soldier," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes one is enough," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Elena Cruz stood there, shaking rain from her umbrella. Dressed in civilian clothes today, jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Without her uniform, the only visible sign of her service was the quiet confidence in her bearing and the thin scar along her jawline. "Sergeant?" Frank nodded, straightening almost imperceptibly. Elena smiled. "Just Elena today, if that's all right." She crossed to the heroes table, setting her bag down and sliding into the seat across from Frank's usual spot. "I hope I'm not intruding on your routine." "Not at all," Frank replied, lowering himself carefully into his chair, his prosthetic leg now a badge of honor rather than something to conceal. "Though I'm afraid this might be more attention than I bargained for." Around them, the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The cook called out orders. Linda refilled coffee cups. Life continued, but with something subtle yet significant, shifted in the atmosphere. "I've been thinking," Elena said, warming her hands around her coffee mug. "I'm stationed at Fort Marshall for at least another year. Maybe this could be a regular thing. Thursday mornings, coffee, conversation." Frank studied her face, so different from his in age and experience, yet connected by threads invisible to many. "I'd like that," he said simply. The weeks that followed saw the heroes' table rarely empty. Veterans from 3 wars took their turns sitting with Frank, sharing stories rarely told, listening more than speaking. First responders stopped in during shift changes. Active duty personnel appeared occasionally, standing a little straighter when Frank nodded his acknowledgement. 1 month after the table's dedication, Frank approached the diner for his now famous Thursday meeting with Elena. As he reached for the door, it swung open from inside. A teenager, perhaps 15, with a backpack slung over one shoulder, held it wide. The boy's eyes moved to Frank's veteran's cap, then to his face. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, the words natural, unforced. Frank paused, remembering a time when such acknowledgements were rare, when veterans of his era returned to silence or worse. He thought of all that had changed in a few short weeks because one person had refused to let disrespect stand unchallenged. "You're welcome, son," Frank replied, a smile warming his lined face as he stepped into the light and warmth of the diner, where Eleanor waited at their table and where his past had finally become not a burden to bear alone, but a legacy to share.